Contra started with one man's frustrations around a botched company acquisition and has now grown into one of the world's largest growing independent work platforms. And it all started with the idea that there needs to be a better ecosystem for independent creative work.
It wasn't like some master plan, and I was like, hey, no, the status quo sucks.
And that idea came from Ben Huffman, the founder and the CEO. But before he was building companies, he was freelancing in music production for Sony. Ben built and scaled his first small business, Ripe, while using freelance talent from all the major platforms, only to realize that the business models that existed were pitting users against each other. After his favorite marketplace crew was acquired and shut down, the idea for Contra was born. Contra is enabling independents to run their freelance businesses like pros, with over 50 million in earnings made by independents on Contra, all commission free. So, what could be next in the world of independent work, and how can Contra help? Join Ben and I in this conversation to uncover that very answer and a multitude of other topics. So grab a pen and paper and let's get into it. And it's been such a long time. It's great to get a chance to chat with you in this new era of Contra. We met way back in the day in Brooklyn, New York, and when you had Ripe and you were running that company, and you were interviewing me in your Brooklyn apartment just with this kind of semblance of idea of what Contra was going to be. So It's exciting to kind of dive in and kind of learn the whole story from then to now.
Wow, that's so crazy. It's been that long. But I love to see all of the awards you've won. I love to see all the work that you've put out. It's just you've really leveled up your craft. But to be fair, you were really good back then from what I remember. And the work you did for Ripe was really solid. So it seems like you've been progressing alongside of kind of everything I've been doing on the Contra side. But I think when we first talked about this, there was literally nothing. There was no product. There was no brand. It was just an idea. And I think the idea was hey, what if we made a freelancer marketplace that was completely commission free? And I think that was that was the seed of the idea of Contra. I think that sounds right?
I remember there may have been hey, I made this wireframe, or I was working with a friend and it was kind of skinned, and you were showing me a couple of things behind the scenes. But one of the things that took me by surprise when we were working together on Ripe was you had mentioned, now that I'm a CEO, I don't get to do all of the things that I really loved, like design and production and the craft. And I found that so fascinating, just because looking at you, I'm this handsome gentleman who is toned, is running a health, well, not a health company, but a sort of business catering company, is talking to me about design very intelligently. I'm what the hell is the story behind that?
Yeah, so it's funny. I actually got into technology and into business via the creative world. So I was a music producer, an audio engineer, and I was working with Sony when I first got started making music, pop music, a lot for the UK market. And I always loved design. I love video. I love production. I loved audio, obviously. And so kind of whenever I would start a new project, I'd always try to be involved in the creative as much as possible. And for Ripe, that was a lot. A lot of the initial kind of brand work, the logo, everything from the app wireframes. We had a mobile app actually first for that company, and then we pivoted into the wellness catering company out of necessity. But that's a whole nother story. But I was always super involved in everything from UX to brand to copywriting to the video production to the audio, and that was where my true passion lied, and that was the thing that actually motivated me to keep going. So I'd always kind of mask these kind of business to-dos with what creative project can I do at the same time that kind of goes hand in hand with this objective or whatever. And so with Contra, I really realized that most of my talents were kind of outdated, because I was a freelancer for a while too before I started Ripe, and I would do pitch deck design, UI design, UX design, mobile design, stuff like that. And so whenever I was starting Contra, I realized that hey, I am not good anymore. I am totally out of my element. And so I met who's now our head of creative, Aaron, I met her through a friend of a friend, actually a freelancer I'd worked with at Ripe, and he was more on the strategy side. And he was like, "Yeah, you have to meet my friend Erin. She's like the best brand designer, best brand strategy person I've ever met." And Erin actually was leading a lot of the brand work at Red Antler back in the day, which is like this kind of like famous New York agency, like really known for like doing these massive projects, really famous in the startup world. And so I started working with Aaron, and I was like, wow, yeah, I'm definitely out of my element, but I'd always love to contribute, ideate. Like I would play around in Figma. I guess like back then, I think we were using Sketch and this program called Abstract that would help you it's kind of like GitHub for Sketch, I guess, if you remember Abstract. But this was like pre-Figma. We finally got into Figma in like 2018, but like, or like 2019, I think. But yeah, like that was like super, super early days. And I think it was just wireframes. It was like wireframes is an idea. And I'm curious, like, what did you actually think in that moment? Like, what was your initial reaction?
This will tie into a bunch of different things, but my initial thoughts in the moment
Yeah.
were this could be big because it's not like the perception of the Upwork. It seemed very like creator forward and very much like focused on the talent, for lack of a better word, or that independent market, opposed to like Upwork, which just felt like get the best deal at all costs. Like it was almost like you were just like trying to find the good
Yeah.
bargain. And there's obviously like a need for that and there's a home for that, but that was like so very much not what I was interested in. And I mean, also Dribble at that time like had a marketplace. I think like we found each other on Dribble. I think also
Yeah.
it might have been like 25% or more of my business was inquiries from Dribble. So I also had that thought in the back of my mind. How does this compete or play in that space? Which obviously we'll get to, and it does, and it's very different.
Yeah.
So that was my initial thought. I was just like, if this is positioned correctly, and what I'm hearing from this interview and just seeing like the general product side, this is more oriented and focused around the individual opposed to anything else.
We looked at the competitive landscape, I guess you could call it. I mean, I was a power user of Elance and Odesk before they turned into Upwork. So like I had known this space for a long time. And I started becoming a power user of this marketplace called Crew. I don't know if you remember Crew, but it was the same team that did Unsplash. They were based in Montreal. They had this like high-end designer, engineer marketplace. And so I was a power user of Crew as well. And I remember I also was a power user of Dribble, loved Dribble, still do in a lot of ways. I haven't used it in a long time, but like, I just remember like I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I could go in, look at other people's creative work, get inspired, reach out to them like I did for you. I was like, wow, your work's awesome. Like hopefully we can work together.
Mm-hmm.
Dribble acquired Crew. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is the greatest thing that's ever going to happen. I think Dribble with marketplace infrastructure is exactly what I needed as a small business owner. Because you remember, right, Ripe was like a small business. We had like under 50 people. I think we were only at like $5 or $6 million a year in revenue. Bootstrap for the most part. We had raised like under like $200,000 from angels just to get off the ground. And like, it was just like a totally different business than what like Contra is today. But it was interesting. So Dribble acquires Crew, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. They're going to add payments infrastructure to Dribble. That is the vision. That's what I need. I want this so I can go from, hey, I think Britton's super talented to like, hey, like Britton, would you consider working on this project? That's like what I wanted, and everything to be kind of handled and packaged up. And they ended up shutting down Crew. Like it was a botched acquisition. It just didn't work. I don't know, for whatever reason. I guess like the infrastructure wasn't quite as sophisticated as they thought. And it's funny enough, I caught up with Zach, the former CEO of Dribble, maybe a month or two ago, and I told him this exact story. And apparently, like, the infrastructure wasn't as good as they had thought, and then it just didn't make sense. The actual integration would have been such a huge, massive lift. But basically, my dreams were shattered. I'd been using these platforms for so long. I knew where they could be improved. I knew how I would want them to be improved for my own use case. And I had been a freelancer. So I knew that like, hey, like this like 20% take rate is like very, very, very hard for your average small business owner or freelancer, like your agency owner to stomach. You can't just like pay 20% and then go pay income tax and then pay your team and then pay all of your overhead. It just didn't work. So I was like, there needs to be some type of business model innovation here. And so the seed of Contra was, hey, can we innovate on this business model? Because we know this is going to be a massive, massive thing. We know everyone in the future is going to work independently in some capacity. Everyone in the future is going to value each other's contribution based on the skills they have and the tools they know how to use versus like, oh, I used to work here, I used to work there. Now as like an agency owner, I'm sure like you're like, hey, I need someone who knows Webflow, or I need someone who knows Framer, or I need like a really good UX designer, a really good video editor who can use Premiere or whatever tool that you prefer. But like just like I saw that just from being like a small business owner, I was like, this is probably going to be the future. And we're probably going to need something a little bit more fluid, a little bit more open. And we're going to need to innovate on the business model. So that was the seed.
I mean, it sounded like because of this merger that your dreamed product kind of died in the crib, if you will, and you kind of had to build it yourself and were, I guess, almost forced to in a way.
Yeah.
What specifically connects you to independent workers, and why does it matter so much to you personally?
What a lot of people don't know is that I'm a college dropout and I moved to New York when I was 19, turning 20. And I had so much imposter syndrome. I was really, really good with computers as a kid. Like I built my first computer when I was 13. And I immediately, started pirating software and doing all the things that like young kids do on computers. But all of my friends, it seemed like the friends that I had made throughout my time in New York were all working at cool companies like Facebook, or they had like real tech jobs. And I was like sitting here with like these skills when I was like, hey, like I think I'm pretty good at this stuff. But I had this imposter syndrome that like, hey, like I don't know if I can add value. I don't know if I can get hired. I don't know if like I'm employable. There's all this kind of like internal kind of insecurity. And I remember I got my first freelance project and someone paid me for my expertise. And that was like a light bulb for me. I was like, whoa, you've just validated my skill in a way that like, in terms of the client, they had no idea that they were giving me this validation, this kind of like, they were like lighting a spark saying like, hey, like you actually can do these things. Your skills, your experience, they are valuable. Cause I'd been, designing using Photoshop and video editing since I was like so young. And like, I had like developed these skills that like, I knew I could just like run laps around my peers. And I was like, huh. But for some reason, like I just didn't have the credentials. I didn't have like a university degree to say like, hey, like you can go out and work for one of these companies. And it was a lot more important back then. Now it's like, it seems like it's almost irrelevant. Getting that validation was really powerful for me. And I went from doing all of these odd jobs in New York just to survive as like a struggling musician to all of a sudden being like, hey, like, no, I'm a designer, or like, no, I can, produce digital content or whatever it was. And that was a big shift for me. Like that gave me the confidence that I needed to go out and start my first business or whatever it is. And like, I think that a lot of people are going to enter the workforce in a similar way. And I think that, especially now that everything's global, I mean, there's so much undiscovered talent all over this country, all over the world, right? And I think that there's so many people who just need that break, who just need that validation in their life. And so that was kind of like why we decided to focus on the independent side, because I figured if we can make something that independents think is the best way, is the best product for them, they'll ultimately bring in the client side. And like the traditional advice is to always go after the hard side. And I think people would say that the hard side in our equation would be the client side, but we took the exact opposite of approach with like our brand, with our initial products, with our initial positioning. And we knew we had to eventually build both sides, but that was kind of the thing that like kind of really like made me realize like this is going to be big, is if I can affect other people the same way that that client affected my confidence, like my self-worth, my self-perception, I think that's pretty powerful. And so we've heard a lot of these stories now. People will send me DMs saying like, hey, like, I'm making more money on Contra than I ever did at my full-time job. And this is so validating. This is like giving me the confidence to keep going. I get like messages from users saying like, hey, like I joined Contra, I made $10,000 in my first month. This has changed my life. And these are users in like emerging economies too. Like this isn't just the US. This isn't just like, the Western world. These are people all over the world who are just looking for that access to opportunity. And so a lot of that was what kind of drove the initial thinking of being commission free, of like, our wedge being an independent focused brand. Like, hey, we're focused on the independent. We're not focused on the client. But now as the platform has evolved, like we've really built like best in class products for both sides, not just for independents, but also for clients as well. And like, it's crazy to see how the platform has really evolved, and it has kind of also evolved from that initial seed of like, hey, we just want to be a commission free marketplace, which was kind of tying back to that business model innovation.
Running a small independent business as a creative, it's all about attention. And how do you capture that? How are you found? How are you showing up on the internet? What
Totally.
I've found with talking to many other creatives, there are these gigantic feast and famine cycles. And being on a platform like Contra, I imagine, is a really smooth and nice way to show up. To me, it's like this friend who has your back.
Totally. And like we hear that a lot as well. And I've experienced this, like you'll be flooded with projects and all of a sudden like work kind of dries up, and it's also seasonal. We started Contra actually as like a tool to help independents and freelancers run their business. So the first thing we built was this profile that gave you like a portable reputation that could compound. So you could like get recommendations and things like that. And then we created proposal tools. So you had like a proposal with a built-in contract, and then an invoice tool. So you could just send out invoices and get paid commission free. And that was our initial kind of product. Then we layered on the marketplace. So that way clients could come in and post jobs, clients could come in, send inquiries. Then we built out search. So that way you could search for a skill or a tool and you could find people to work with. And what we're building next is kind of the final like piece that we need to complete the vision for Contra. And so over the years, as we talk to independents, we realize it's okay. Like the number one problem is like, hey, I need leads and I need predictable income. Like that is the number one problem for independent creatives. Then like independents really wanted to have a way to upskill, to build their skills, to learn from others and develop a community. So that was the second big problem. So what we're launching next is a way for independents to build their reputation by participating in a community of their peers. And so this was like kind of like Contra 2.0. This is what, once we realized like, okay, there's like a marketplace problem where like we need a better business model for marketplaces. Like we can't just have this like 20% take rate that doesn't really work with people. Like maybe it works with like eBay, but it doesn't really work with like very like complex services like, building a website or building an app or like creating a video or whatever it is. Like this stuff is like, it's really complex and requires a lot of touch points. People aren't just going to give up 20% of their income to a platform. That doesn't make any sense, especially not in 2024. It didn't make sense in like 2020 when we were really getting off the ground. It makes even less sense now. And so what's coming next is this idea of a community on Contra where like, let's just say you're really great at Framer or you're really great at Spline. You can actually share your work, answer questions, offer support to other people who also have that skill set. And when you offer that support and you share your work and the community thinks it's valuable, and we're going to kind of measure this based on like engagement and upvotes, if they find that valuable, that actually affects your reputation on Contra, which influences your discoverability within like when you apply to jobs, when you show up and discover. And so it's not just about like, oh, like I've been the most successful on Contra and therefore I'll always be like the most successful user on Contra. It's like, hey, like if you're adding value to other people in the community, like, you'll also like see a direct impact to your income. And so like, this is essentially our answer to what like we think the next LinkedIn is going to look like, because LinkedIn is great. There's like a really great professional graph there where like they've basically created the authority on work history. You can go to LinkedIn and you can see anyone and you can see where they've worked, and that's super valuable. And it's really great. It's really turned into like a sales tool, like a marketing tool, a way to get leads. And so we're going to kind of take our take on what that looks like for independent creatives, and we're going to build that into Contra. And when you engage with this part of our product, it can actually impact the amount of leads you get on Contra, the amount of clients that discover you. And we're getting such great clients on Contra now. We've really like developed this client side product that's, I have to say it's best in class. We constantly get that feedback, but like no one knows about it. So like our job now is like spread the word and like get more people in. So that way, the more opportunities that come to Contra, the happier our independent side is. And then as we introduce this community, there's going to be ways to actually market yourself, like to share your work, to share your wins, to share your knowledge, to express yourself in ways that maybe you probably wouldn't do. I guess you could do it. I think the closest comparable would be like a Twitter. And I think Twitter's done a really great job, but there's also so much other stuff on Twitter, right? And like when you post things on Twitter, that doesn't really compound in a way that directly impacts the amount of leads you get or like the income that you have. And so I don't know, we'll see where that goes, but like that's the next big iteration of Contra, and like pretty excited to like show the world because it was actually designed by our users. We didn't think of this idea ourselves. Like we had our users reach out and say like, hey, like, you know, what would this look like? And we actually hired one of our community members to build it, to like design it. So we'll see like what the response is.
Well, that's like taking it full circle. Idea came from your audience, designed by your audience. It's truly created from the people that love and engage with your platform on a daily to day basis, which I think is beautiful. But I think the community aspect of adding that in and incentivizing kind of like being a good person on the platform is truly beautiful and innovative as well, because I think community is the thing that made Dribble in its heyday so cool and valuable. When the comments weren't just like nice, it was like, hey, have you thought about this? And there was actually constructive criticism. Or you could reach out and ask a question to your favorite designer and they would actually answer you, but they might not like check their email, or it might go to spam. They were definitely going to check Dribble because it was like that peer-to-peer relationship. And it just made us all grow simultaneously because we all just wanted to, I don't know, be as good as like the guys at Unseen or something.
Unseen is incredible, by the way. I've done 2 projects with them, and both of them have just been absolutely killer. I think the first one was like our freelance industry report we did back in 2021. I think that's actually what ultimately got Contra on the map. And then from there, I think we just recently, I don't know if you saw it, but we launched this like calculator project with them, and it's just like so cool. Like it took us like months to like actually conceptualize this thing, build the back end and everything. And it's really cool to collaborate with that team. I can't say enough good things.
With your background with freelancing and design and audio and all of those kind of creative pursuits, it does seem that Contra has always been sort of brand forward and really cared about the branding aspect of that, of the company itself. And so I'm curious, your perspectives on branding around Contra and the philosophies and ideology there, but also if there are people in the audience who are like, okay, if I work internally at a company that isn't so brand forward, how do I maybe introduce more brand vernacular language aesthetic to make that company, I guess, like a little bit more contemporary?
That was the very first thing that we did, was like, hey, let's like figure out the brand. Because in my opinion, it's the most important part of any company. It's like the movement. It's like the lifeblood. It's like the beating heart of like the entire thing. Like what is a product without a brand? You know, what is anything without a brand, right? I think we all have brands. And like to answer the other question is like, how can you kind of go bottoms up with brand? I don't know if you can. I think it has to be a priority of the people who are in charge of an organization or the product or whatever it is. But like, I think brand is it's just so important. And also like how it's funny that you said Contra feels like a friend who has your back. That's literally one of the things we wrote in our first, I'm not even joking. Like that's like one of the things that we wrote in our first kind of brand exploration. Like that's what we wanted Contra to feel like, the friend that has your back. And I think, but like towards independence, right? Like being very independent first and being very mindful of that, and being very mindful of like what it meant to be like permanently online. Like this was back in like 2018, 2019. It really accelerated with the pandemic, but like we saw this culture emerging where it's like, hey, like see you on the internet. Doesn't matter where you are. Doesn't matter where you're located. If you have value, if you're a good person, if you have skills, like we'll connect and we'll be friends. Like that was kind of like the vibe. And yeah, it's just crazy to see that that's what you took away. That's what you've taken away from the Contra brand, which means it worked. But like that was like really, really intense. I think it was like a 2-month sprint where we were just like iterating and iterating. And to Erin's credit, she nailed the logo in round 1. Like she basically had the logo in literally the first round, and we never changed it. We haven't changed it since. And so, you know, after we kind of went in that direction, my second job was to like, okay, how do we get the domain? And so that was a whole nother thing. But like, I think brand is just so under, and maybe it's not undervalued, but I think that a lot of people will kind of think about it from like a secondary perspective. But I think, if you're really committed to something, I think getting the brand right will just save you so many. It'll not only accelerate your vision and accelerate the kind of acceptance of that vision, but like it'll just do you so many favors, I think, in the long run. And we'll see, right? Like we're always iterating on the brand. We're always iterating on like the different colors we use and the fonts we use, but I don't know, the vibe stays the same. So
That's the important thing because like a brand shouldn't stay static. It is like the foundational pillar, the lifeblood, and it really, like you said, it's a movement. It's someone's gut reaction.
yeah.
It's more ethereal than we probably believe, but I mean, it's something that you can latch onto and really rally behind.
Yeah.
In my experience working with other tech founders, there's this thought process where you can just like change the brand in, X amount of months or years. And it's more of like a hard pivot directly opposed to, so almost like steps or stepping stones in a way, opposed to something that carries you throughout your entire company lifespan. So I think like those two are different perspectives.
I totally agree. I think, you always see these like different like B2B SaaS companies who perform some like very obscure like cybersecurity or whatever, like low level data problem. And like, does their brand matter? Probably not. Right? Like they're going to print money and they have like industry veterans who come in, they operate, they spin up sales, they spin up product because it's like a very like, it's not a consumer facing product. And, it doesn't really matter for them. And I think that I always look at those kind of situations, just how does this work? But it does. And so like, there's like multiple ways to go about this, but Contra is very much speaking to people who are very smart, very talented, very creative in their own right, and they have opinions. And so like, if we don't have something that's extremely compelling, that's really polished, that's really good, like, why do we deserve to be speaking to this like group of talented people? And I think like that's like a pretty big challenge that I recognized from the very beginning. It's like, we can't just like phone it in and just like kind of halfway do our brand. Like it has to be really good. And we have to produce things that are inspiring to the people that we're speaking to, because our users are so freaking talented. Like they could probably build brands just as good as Contra. So we need to give it our all. And like, we really have to like have a core set of values and a core message and a core vision that will resonate and hopefully continue to resonate. But there's always iterations, right? There's like the colors, the font styles, whatever, but like the vibe stays the same. And I feel like that's the important thing that we wanted to get right, especially given that we are more of a consumer style product, even though you can consider like independent business owners as, prosumer, and you can consider the client side more of like a B2B type of product. But I've always considered Contra a consumer brand, and we really want to maintain that quality. And like some of the brands I look up to, like Airbnb, it's like, wow, they've done such an amazing job. And they didn't always have like the perfect logo. They didn't always have like, the perfect typeface or the perfect aesthetic. But they've always like really had a great like kind of internal mission, like internal vibe, like, everyone should feel like a local. I can't remember what their mission statement is, but it's really powerful. And now like their design aesthetic and their brand is really kept up, and it's really evolved into something crazy. And so I think that's a company that I think did brand really well. And that's something that, we always wanted to try to emulate at Contra as well.
You had mentioned before about SaaS companies versus commission, or we were touching on that line a little while ago, a couple points ago. And I'm curious because from my perspective, you could probably produce more income going with a commission based business model versus a more, I don't want to say SaaS, but a subscription based pricing model. But it seems like the differentiator is your value system, not taking those commissions so that you're not draining the lifeblood of your audience in a way. So I'm curious, when you're thinking about value and thinking about the fundamental business itself, how did you go about setting that up? And was it like a hard decision to make based on the market, the competition, things that you were analyzing to actually set up Contra from a foundational perspective?
Core idea is that because we are commission free, as the product catches up and we hit parity with all of these other platforms, like it is going to like the market, full of rational actors, they're going to use Contra because it is just the most efficient, easiest platform to use. And so our theory is that we're going to be able to be much bigger than an Upwork, much bigger than a Fiverr. We're going to have a much bigger ecosystem, and that we'll actually be able to monetize more. We'll actually be able to scale revenue more than an Upwork or more than like a Fiverr. And I think, it's interesting. I spoke to the former CFO of Odesk, and this is like when they were merging, he was the person who was responsible for the merger, or he was there whenever the merger with Elance happened, which ultimately turned into Upwork. And like the biggest problem they had was retention on the client side, the buyer, because like the buyer would come in, they would hire someone, they'd pay the 20%, and immediately they would disintermediate. They would take it off platform. And it's obvious because like you can't get double taxed on your income. Like you have government taxes and you can't have platform taxes as well. I mean, you can, but it's just not going to be a sustainable business model. And I think they still have that problem today. There's so many people who come to use Contra from Upwork who are saying like, hey, we just can't afford the fees. Like I can't afford my life with like paying these commission fees. And that's crazy, right? But I think long term, like if you think about how big this market truly is, like because of like AI, because of like video calling, because of Notion, because of Loom, because of all these technological innovations we've had over like the last 10 years and what we're going to see over the next 5 years, skills-based work, like what you can do and like the tools you can use, like the skills you can actually deliver it's going to be the most important thing, right? It's not going to be freelancing versus full-time versus contracting versus agency versus whatever. It's just going to be work. And that's the way that we're going to exchange value in this like hyper online world that we live in. And so like the market is so big, we're talking trillions of dollars. And so like Contra just wants to be one, we want to be the easiest and the best place for independents to accept payments. And then two, we want to be the best and most like the easiest and the best place for clients to find the skill and the person they're looking to work with. And then three, we want to have the most important, most advantageous reputation system for independence as well. Because like if you think about what makes LinkedIn work, they have authority on this kind of work history data set. But like that data set is like, hey, I worked at Apple and then I worked at Meta and then I worked at Google. And like that's almost like a negative signal now. Like what you actually want to know is like, what did you do at Apple? What did you do at Facebook? What did you do at Google? Like, what are the actual projects you did? What tools did you use? Can you help me with my problem? Because I need to use this specific thing. And like, how fast can you do it? Are you trustworthy? Like, those are going to be the new kind of professional indicators. And like, because we have the most frictionless system, I think ultimately we'll have authority on this new type of work history data set. And that data set will power our entire platform, and it's going to scale to be much, much larger than an Upwork. Because the biggest issue that like an Upwork or a Fiverr has is that their client side is pissed off, low NPS, and their independent side is pissed off, low NPS. Like that's not sustainable. Like, yeah, you can like try to extract and like squeeze as much juice out of the system, but like, you're essentially squeezing a wet rag at this point. Like little drops are coming out, but like people are upset. People are like, hey, we need a better solution. And that's what we're building at Contra. And like I said, like our product's at parity now. Like you can get paid super easily. And like, I want to say it's like 140 countries. We're constantly adding new payment methods. Like our contracts are super advantageous for both sides. Like we've made the platform super frictionless and like, there's less bugs. There's like, we just like slowly chip away at it. And like, I think long term, like we're going to build this new type of professional network. It's not just going to be a marketplace. It's going to be a place that actually connects people in this new paradigm of work. And so like, I think that's what Contra is ultimately evolving into. And that's why I think that the commission fee is just like Web 1.0. It's like, how do we apply the eBay model to like very complex relationships? You can't do it.
You had said something really interesting, Ben, about kind of authority. And it made me think like for any brand or business, authority and trust are kind of your main currency. Because if you lose either of those, you're going to lose market share or reputation, your value, and then ultimately there'll be repercussions down the road. So, from an early company foundational perspective, let's say pre seed or seed, how do you build that authority and trust with an audience that may not be understanding of what you're trying to do because there's not a ton of word of mouth? So, how do you gather that attention, that authority and trust, and kind of snowball effect that so that you can become bigger?
I mean, it's a great question. It was really, really hard for us in the early days because one, you're like an unknown entity as like a new brand that's coming in. Two, you have this like almost too good to be true value proposition, which is like, hey, we're commission free. Like the biggest place that we lost trust in the early days was like, hey, like how do you guys make money? Like if you're not taking a commission fee, like what's the catch? How do you make money? And then we slowly rolled out monetization, first on the independent side. And then as like last February, we rolled out our client side monetization. And it's crazy to see that like as we like actually expose the business model, like the subscription model, people trust us more and more. And so it's just hard. I think it literally happens one interaction at a time. Like, we are so obsessed. Like our Slack is filled with like webhooks. Like every activity that happens, like every important action that happens on Contra, we get a webhook and we make sure that like, hey, like for example, like every single job that comes through Contra, like we manually review and we have very strict limits. Like we will not let a job below $25 an hour show up on our job feed. Like, and if it does, it's like by some crazy mistake, it got past our AI, it got past our human like eval. And then for the longest time, we manually reviewed every single inquiry as well. So we knew that there was no one spamming. There was no one trying to, and do things get through every once in a while? Sure. But like those little things that we did, like that human curation over time is like, it's just like the hard things. You just like sweat the details. And even to this day, like we built like all of like our moderation models off of like human curation. And so like now there's AI and there's a bunch of tools that like really help us. But like, I think it's really one interaction by one interaction. Like our users are surprised all the time when like they'll get a support message answer from me. They're just like, wait, what? Or like, I'll jump on a sales call. They'll be like, wait, why are you on this call? And I'm like, this is because this is how we do it. Like we're extremely customer obsessed. And I think if you do that enough, there's like I don't think there's any quick win to build trust, especially for a platform like Contra when we're like dealing with people's money. Like, holy shit. Like, that's when like your guard is the highest. Like, people are like, you can't mess with like my paycheck, my livelihood. And so it's just one interaction after another. You just have to constantly try to do your best to like, hey, like I'm going to like make this user's day, this user's day, this user's day over and over and over. And eventually it compounds and like word of mouth comes around and people recognize that you're going the extra mile. That kind of stuff is just like kind of like the unsexy, like unglamorous kind of like, belly of the beast type of stuff that like no one talks about. They're always talking about like, how do you scale? How do you do this? But it's like, I think it's literally in the early days, it's just like 1-to-1. And like, that's it. Like literally 1-to-1. Like me showing up to a user interview or like us doing a user interview in person versus like a video call. That's like an example. And like, I did that like all over the country. Like when I moved to SF, I did the exact same thing. I was like, all right, I'm just going to like talk to people who have signed up and just like take them out to lunch and like hear what their actual feedback, what are their actual problems.
I think that's how it should be done. And a lot of people are trying to maybe milk AI to make things easier, faster, and also more cost effective for them by eliminating the human aspect.
I'm curious your thoughts on like, there's a lot of like FUD in the market around like, oh, AI is going to take all of our jobs. I'm curious your take on this.
I think a different thing I feel like every week, but here's the bare bones of how I think about it at the moment, where it is a tool to enable you to do more. But I do think that there's a caveat that we as a species of humanity can't lose our human creativity. And I do believe that a lot of what makes art good art is the tension and release, the mistakes, the interesting nuances. I listen to a decent amount of like Rick Rubin, other musicians and artists in general outside of just like design, even in like the tech world. And I feel like my overall mentality is pretty like, but I do think that if we use it correctly for the betterment of people and we keep that as the main priority, it'll always be a tool that can be interesting and unique. Ultimately, I do think that it has made me prioritize and value physical made objects a lot more. So I've kind of have a deeper respect for the craftsmanship of items and materialities, even digital craftsmanship. Um, like let's say a beautiful website or a brand, and if I know the team that made it and I know that like they're doing everything kind of like from scratch, I always appreciate it more. And I think there is always that mentality, like a handmade chair by your friend is more impressive than a chair that you buy in the store. And I think that applies to, let's say, AI generated images, or if we apply it to like music, having it produce or kick out a song in the style of Nirvana, that's a lot different than, hearing something that was made in the 90s and that you have a nostalgic connection to.
That's a really good point. Did you see that the CEO of Procreate basically came out and was like, hey, like, I never get in front of the camera, but I have to say this. I hate generative AI, and we will never put generative AI into our products. That was crazy. That was unexpected and crazy. Like, what was your initial reaction to that? That was like pretty wild.
It was very much like a beautiful mentality of like, this is our whole business, this is the whole shebang. It's kind of like almost like the analogy of like the captain goes down with the ship kind of thing. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen to them, but it's like we're all in. Like human creativity is what we do and stand for. So from a way, it's just like, okay, I know exactly where they stand. I probably like them more just for how bold that decision was. And probably a lot of other people think the same way. And then there's probably a camp of people like, okay, well, that may be something that, takes away from this company ever going public or whatever from that perspective. But I think that, taking it back to brand, the Procreate brand is all about the artist. It's all about creativity. So from a branding perspective, they're really leaning into their values and makes the company that more human and likable.
So the most powerful messages have like tons of love and tons of hate. And like that tension, I think, ultimately will make that company even more relevant. I'm surprised. I'll be surprised if that doesn't like add a ton of revenue and a ton of new users to Procreate, which is a really cool tool anyway. I want to say that like anything in life exists, at least anything in life that's winning exists at this edge. And that edge is always created by something that is very unique and unknown to a lot of other people. And so let's just take content creation or like UGC content for an example. Like the edge in UGC content is always that like the opener or like that hook or like that style or like the way it grabs your attention or the way it loops. There's all these different edges that kind of like, come in, and that requires tons and tons of creativity. And oftentimes it's like creativity that's relevant to humans. Like what is like going to be relevant to an audience, and like maybe AI can do that one day, but like let's just say everyone starts using AI influencers for everything. All of a sudden, like there's no edge there. And so the edge becomes like, hey, like this really human, like produced like skit that like is really funny and like it touches current events or whatever. And like that becomes the edge. And then everyone's doing that. And then all of a sudden, like people who are like really creative and funny, but also using AI, that, and then it just becomes the edge. So I think it's like always a moving target. And so like another example is like AI SDRs or AI business development. Like if everyone is using AI business development, like bots or like AI agents, and everyone's getting spammed with a bunch of like AI generated sales copy, that edge is gone, right? All of a sudden you have to find a new edge. And now the edge is like, I'm going to send you a personalized loom that says your name, and I'm going to like hold up a piece of paper that proves that this isn't AI, right? Like all of a sudden, like that becomes the edge. And so like, I wonder, like, I think we're just so complex. I think the skill sets will change. I think skills that have relevancy today will probably be automated by AI, but then there's going to be a variation of that skill set that creates that edge that's always going to be in demand. And I think that, the prediction of everyone getting replaced by technology has come and gone so many times. It's like, I think perpetual. It's like just part of our species, I think. But I'm pretty confident that like humans are like, we're status seeking, right? Like we need value from each other, right? Like we exchange value in very complex ways. And I think if the ways that we exchange value today get automated by AI, we're just going to invent new ways and new forms of value. Like all of a sudden, if like coding is no longer valuable to people, maybe coding plus this becomes extremely valuable. And now the coding foundation is developed by, like that's done with, AI, but then there's like this other layer that's like very human, very curated, very different, very unique. That skill is going to become in demand and people are going to get paid for it. And so I don't know. I don't think we're all going to be like jobless and like UBI is going to be some big thing. I think it fits a narrative for fundraising for AI companies and like chip manufacturers. But I think ultimately like the skills and the targets are always moving, especially in the creative world, especially with marketing, especially with getting attention. And like, I like to buy things from people. And I think that's always going to be the case because there's a relationship there. There's like, even if it's like shallow, it's like that human to human connection, I think is going to be pretty important. And if everyone's replaced by AI, then like who's going to buy things? Does that mean businesses don't exist? So I think there's just like so many holes in the narrative that, I think it's really fun to like contemplate, but it's becoming very consensus now. And I think the contrarian view is that no, the skills are just going to change, and it's actually going to be there's going to be a boom in demand for like new types of skills. There's going to be a new unlock in the types of things we can spend our time on, which I'm very excited about because we can all just be a little bit more creative. And I can get back to my roots, kind of going full circle to like your first point is like, maybe I can spend more time doing more creative things in the future.
There's so many things that are like unknown, and obviously like we can connect the dots looking back, not forward. We can only make predictions and see, if after 2 years coming back to this podcast, what is true or not true. I do think that anytime you get new technology, there's always so many new jobs, and people will find a way to create new jobs. I think about like YouTube as a tool. Now there's like YouTube business runners where they like know the analytics, how to grow YouTube channels. It's like an industry, and it's like very systematized, and they have it all down based on like the algorithm and the models. And like that wasn't a job. Like even like the creation of the computer and code and all of these different like technologies allowed us to advance. And I mean, if we take it back to creativity, like up until X amount of years ago, maybe like 2018, there wasn't a ton of 3D on the web because of technical limitations. We had to allow the internet and technologies to evolve to even be able to do that. Before that, it was just like CG effects for movies or for art's sake in a way. So, I mean, like as things progress, our tastes change, which enables different mediums and also technologies to really shine. But everything is kind of cyclical in a nature where, even if we take it to a music example, like the latest Lizzo album was heavily inspired by 80s, like synth pop and other music. That wasn't in trend 10 years ago, and maybe won't be in trend 2 years from now. So I think that we combine things, we put the human perspective on it, and it really shifts and adapts to what we can create. And AI will be a tool, but through like a humanistic lens, it could be really amazing and powerful. And it may enable some people to find new skills that are not using it at all, but are very desirable because of that handmade or handcrafted mentality.
I love that perspective. And like, I think it just ties back to this like forever moving target of what is that edge. And who knows? I think that's always going to exist with like just like human taste and the things that are important to us. If there is a world where like AI taste and robotic taste becomes more important than human taste, then I think that's a different conversation. But at that point, like there's so many other fundamental shifts in society that like will be like bigger problems than like we're not going to really worry about jobs at that point. So I don't know. I'm pretty excited and bullish. Like I love your optimism here, and I think I share that. I think there's just going to be so much more opportunity. The demand for creativity is going to go way up, and the things that we can actually create is just going to be mind blowing. So I'm excited for the future.
Digital products and physical products have their own kind of different, I guess, like almost like sales mentalities in the way. And I'm curious if you're a fan of the brand Teenage Engineering and their products coming from like a music background.
2003 is like when I really started messing around with computers. And so I was already past the like analog synth days. And so I started out in music playing the saxophone in the fifth grade. And then that was like led me to being a drummer. So like I was a drummer. That's how I got into like true, like what we consider music, like pop music. Or like I was into metal, but like whatever, like, modern music. And I immediately went to digital music production. And so I never had synths. I never could, for one, I could afford them. They're so expensive, right? Like I think that was like the true limitation there. But then like there was just like this endless world of possibilities in these like digital audio workstations. Like you could just download any instrument. You could recreate any instrument, any whatever. Like there's
Well, I think it's interesting because I think that was like the big debate in like music industry, like analog versus digital,
yeah,
and it kind of compares to AI versus like entirely handmade or digitally made. And I
yeah,
think that it's like a similar argument. Obviously, has its differences, and AI can do music, but from that perspective, I think it's just like how you're using the tools, and even like the example of I can't remember the name of the producer, but he did the track for Kendrick Lamar's Damn album, Humble, but he did it
oh yeah,
entirely on his phone and produced it that way. So it
wild,
was like a use case of like everyone has these tools or the great
yeah,
equalizer. It's the human element that makes it a great beat. And
100%.
then who's going to be on the track doing like the actual like rapping or singing that kind of makes the full circle kind of picture come
Yeah.
to life.
Yeah, so the edge there is the vibe of the track of the instrumental, right? But then without the brand of Kendrick, right? Does it even cut through? Does it win? And that's like a perfect example. But that's wild. I did not know that it was made on a phone. That's pretty nuts. And I would say that like, I recently used Suno. It's like a AI music generator to make a track for a case study that we shot in New York. And it was pretty good. But when we're making these product videos, for to like promote Contra, like, we've been like doing a bunch of these like little like screen studio. If you've seen that product, and like we'll basically do like a screen studio recording of a new feature we launch, and then we'll like throw in some audio in the background. I am scouring Bandcamp, funny enough, for all these independent artists that I can just like use one of their tracks, like use like a little 15-second cut. And then traditionally, I've made all the music for our launch videos, just like custom. I just like make it myself. And I think I'll still do that because one, the IKEA effect, right? You make it yourself and you feel like it's more valuable. But two, like I think the AI music program for someone who has the skill of music production, I can't get granular enough. Like in the prompt, I'll put like, hey, I want it in this key. This is where I want the bridge to go. I want this to be the vibe. And it still doesn't quite give me the control that I want. And so I think the edge will always be like, you can get the foundation, like maybe I can get the drum tracks from AI, or I can get some samples to be like AI generated, great, royalty free, awesome. But then that edge is still the human curation. Like, where can you make this different enough from everything else where it'll like cut through the noise? Cause like I saw some stat, it said there's like 100,000 new tracks released like per day or something. I can't remember. It was like something crazy. So like already before AI, the value of music production is just like falling off a cliff because it no longer requires a studio, it no longer requires a label. So that's a trend that's already been going. But the stuff that really catches your ear, the stuff that you really want to listen to, that you play over and over and over again, like that has a certain edge to it. And like finding that edge is like trial and error. It's a lot of error. It might be some imperfection. Who knows? But yeah, I think that's going to continue across all creative fields forever. And I think it's just a moving target. And as long as there's a moving target in taste, and as long as taste is cyclical, like you were mentioning earlier, then I think humans are going to be okay.
I am interested to take it back to Contra, and this is tying into humans specifically, but it seems like you have a couple of different audiences. There's
Yeah.
the independent, and then there's the people that are hiring the independent.
Mhm.
And it seems like
Yeah.
you as of you can correct me on the dates, but you recently launched Contra for companies as a service as well. So that's three potential
Yeah.
audiences. So
Yeah.
I'm curious how you focus, prioritize, and serve each of those audiences individually.
Luckily, there's a lot of overlap in the needs. And I'll give you an example. So when we think about it internally, we have independents and then we have agencies, like agency owners are like a huge user of Contra. And then we have like just your normal SMB client or like your normal one-off individual hirer. I think they really use our self-serve product. And then we have like creative directors and companies. So it's like independents, agencies and agency owners, creative directors and like the kind of companies they work at because they're like building out these creative teams. And then there's like this kind of like fourth entrant, which is interesting, which are creator tools like Webflow, like Framer, like Spline, like Rive, like Wix, like all these like Bubble, like all these great tools that actually enable people to like earn a living, to like produce things that they couldn't before. And so we kind of have to like talk to all of them, but it's interesting. So creator tools depend on agencies to get adoption at big clients, right? So for like the big companies, like creator tools need to have relationships with these agencies to get these big contracts. Agencies need to have relationships with these independents because they might not have that skill in house. So like, let's just say that an agency gets like this giant website build and all of a sudden they're like, hey, we want to build this in Framer. And they're like, oh, we've only ever used WordPress. So now they need to hire an expert for, that Framer build. And so all of a sudden you have a creator tool that's talking to an agency, and that agency is looking for an expert in that tool. So now the creator tool is also talking to Contra because they want to have their expert program. And then you have the creative director at the company who's hiring the agency. And so like, it's just like this crazy intertwined ecosystem that we're seeing kind of like evolve on Contra. And like, our job is to kind of like get out of the way. So we want to provide like the credentials. We want to provide the like infrastructure to like make the transaction successful. We want to provide like the reputation on both sides. So there's trust, but ultimately like these ecosystems exist offline in an extremely fragmented way. What happens when like you remove some of those barriers and you allow this thing to run a bit more smooth, like a bit more smoothly, like what happens then? And I think that's what we're starting to see on Contra. And so while those are all different audiences, they all have like very similar jobs to be done, and all of their jobs to be done kind of depend on each other. And so like we're kind of seeing this like new ecosystem, this kind of like I said, it's more like a creative professional network than anything else. And so it's basically if like LinkedIn was built today and also had payments, like that's kind of like what Contra is. And so, Contra for companies is used by both agency owners, it's used by creator tools, it's used by companies. And then on the independent side, independents work with agencies, they work with creator tool companies directly, they work with creative directors directly. And so like there's just all of these different kind of cross-pollination opportunities on Contra, and like we're just seeing it happen in real time. And so that's why we're so excited to kind of launch a true community where people can like engage not in just like a working relationship, but also in like more of like a knowledge transfer, and almost like, can I show off my latest project? Can I ask for feedback on this design? Can I ask for help on installing this Framer component or whatever it is? Like that's also going to be another vector where people just can engage and interact. And I think it's like the ecosystem, everyone kind of depends on each other. And I think that like, we just kind of want to get out of the way. Like we're not taking a cut. We're just like helping facilitate that and trying to build trust along the way. And then that ultimately, like I said, creates more trust in the platform. It creates more authority on like that reputation. And it allows us to build a better payments infrastructure, build a better reputation infrastructure, build a better transactional infrastructure, whatever it is. Like it just allows us to improve over time. And so it's difficult. The marketing challenge, like we're a small team, but like we are power users of Contra. Like some of we hire everything from Framer experts to video editors to engineers to designers. Like I said, like the next feature we're rolling out, like the next big bet of Contra was not designed internally at Contra. It was designed by our users. And so like I think that like that is like kind of the benefit, but also like the challenge of like having such a wide and broad platform.
From a perspective of a small agency owner, The biggest limitation to rogue scaling is the ability to handle an influx of projects if we do win them. So, how do we find vetted talent if we've never worked with them before? And that Contra does really well. You can chat with people, you can find them, look at their skills.
I think the core problem that Contra has solved is we enable agency owners to build a bench of talent that they can tap into when their client workload gets unmanageable. Because ultimately, like once you get those projects, your next problem is like, okay, do I have the capacity internally to like handle this? And if not, who can I count on? Who is going to do like a good job that's up to my standard? And then can we deliver this in a timeline that's like sufficient for our clients? And like, agencies use Contra to basically build up that talent bench. So when that time comes, they can tap into someone like that. So they're not like asking for referrals. So they're not going into DMs. They're not like using all these different fragmented systems. You basically have a bench of talent that you can tap into. And then if you want to kick off a project, it's just like one click. Or if you want to create a brief, it's like one click and you can send it out to like the people in your network. It's that easy. And so, we've really helped a lot of agency owners actually scale with variable cost versus fixed cost, because the other risk of that is like building out a huge internal team at an agency is that the ebbs and flows of demand of client demand it's just too spiky, right? So like you don't want to have to like lay people off or fire people whenever like things slow down, but you also can't hire people quick enough when things speed up. And so like the way that like Hollywood has always operated is the way that like a lot of agency owners are starting to operate, and like really having that bench of talent, that roster organized in a way that like you can just tap into them when the need arises. And so that's how most agency owners are using us today. And that's our Contra for Companies product, because like we built it off of our own use case. And then we also, our first design partner was actually the Framer team. And we built it around their use case. We saw how they were using it. We saw how we were using it. And then our first like big agency customer was Beryl, located in New York, Peter Kang. And, we had worked with some smaller agencies before, but like he was like the first like big, like full-fledged, like I think they're a holding company of multiple agencies. And we saw their use case and they work the same way we did, in the same way that Framer did. And so I think across like modern organizations are just starting to think about like skills versus like roles, and work is not freelance versus full-time. It's just work. And it's just a whole new way of thinking about it. And so Contra's kind of enabled that for the agency side, but the same way that we help agencies with that, like we could help a creative director do the exact same thing, or we can help a startup like Contra do the exact same thing, or a creator tool like Framer do the exact same thing. And so I think the way that we all collaborate is changing, the way we all work is changing, and we're just trying to like make a better, more advantageous win-win ecosystem around that. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We just want to like help facilitate this in the direction we already know this is going. Because if it's not Contra, someone else is going to do this. And so I just happen to have this like personal problem, and like I had, I was like really close to the source. Like I was just living it. And so I accidentally kind of saw this and I was like, oh, well, this would be pretty cool to have. So, that's kind of Contra in a nutshell. It wasn't like some like master plan. And I was like, hey, like, no, like the status quo sucks. Like, why does it suck? It doesn't have to. Like, where is the world going? And just kind of riding that wave.
I think small teams are kind of the future at the moment. They're nimble, they're fast. I've talked to a lot of different agency owners, companies in general, and they're like, oh, I long for the days where we were 7 to 15 people and we didn't have 100.
Yeah.
I think you're able to do so much more than you could ever dream of while staying small and nimble, and it allows you to pivot. And I think that's probably a pretty important thing for brand consistency, but also this idea of innovation versus consistency. And they're equally as important, but it's just knowing when to stay consistent and when to innovate. Is that something that's top of mind at Contra?
I heard this quote. It was, you can iterate yourself into irrelevance, which basically means like you can just like continue to improve the same thing and kind of exist on this like local maxima of your potential. And I think part of the responsibility of any brand, part of the responsibility of any product is to constantly plant new flags and to explore new territory. And I think that's something that I think about deeply quite a bit, because there's so much stuff that you can always build inward, right? Like it's like, do you expand the city gates or do you lay fiber optic? I think you have to kind of do both at the same time. And I think if you want to be competitive especially in the space that we play in, is like you always have to differentiate and plant new flags. And so we're always trying to think about ways that we can try new things. And, not all of them work. In fact, most of them don't. Like oftentimes we'll like try to like innovate here and it'll either be a hit or it won't, or sometimes we'll build something and everyone's like, oh, this is amazing. But I think it's the responsibility of a brand. And that's not just with like product, right? It's with brand too. And so thinking about what's the next big initiative we're going to kick off, or like what's the next kind of like, what's the vibe we're going to give off? Like, how do we evolve that as well?
Well, it's interesting because I think of like, what if Napoleon didn't invade Russia and strengthened all the borders is like one question. I mean, obviously that's like wargaming history, if you will, but in a way it's similar because it's like risk is important for any business, but it needs to be strategic. It needs to be calculated in a way. And ultimately there's that analytical side versus the gut reaction, the heart, and balancing the two.
My biggest fear is like iterating into irrelevance. But there's also an equally weighted fear of like, oh, like maybe like spreading yourself too thin is also a death sentence.
Are there any trends or thoughts on where the future may be for the independent worker? I have a statistic here that I thought was interesting. This was McKinsey in 2022. They said that 36% of the workforce was independent, and other sources have clocked it more towards like 42, 46 at this point in time, which is pretty crazy. So I guess if we were to ask you, Ben, what maybe some predictions about the course of independent work, do we even just take that out and just call it work?
Just the way we all work and exchange value is changing. And especially with the younger generation, like the job market's not good. Like entry-level jobs are like, first of all, they're not there. And the ones that are like soul sucking. And it's almost like you're going into something that is like a lose-lose situation. You kind of like mix this with like kind of the way our education system is built. Like tons of people take on enormous amounts of debt to like get college degrees. And so they have student loans. So it's just like, there's all these like kind of forces that are creating pressure on the shift into like, hey, there has to be a better way. And I think skills-based independent work is one of those. It's part of the answer, but I think the majority of people will work independently in some capacity, probably in the next like 10 to 15 years, if not sooner. And then you're already seeing like overrepresentation with like the younger generations. And I think it's just going to be normal. I think it's just going to be work. Like you're going to have like multiple income streams. I think this idea of like a 9 to 5, or like this idea of like this kind of like corporate like security, I think that was like kind of thrown out the window. At least it was in tech over the last like 3 years. Like people who thought they had job security, maybe it wasn't as secure. And I think, it's a tough thing to realize, but I think it's also like an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity to think about like, hey, like what skills do I have? Like, how can I learn to market myself? How can I learn a new skill? And I think a trend that we're going to see is just like people upskilling, whether it's with like AI, whether it's with tools like, Framer, whether it's into design or being an engineer or whatever the next in-demand skill will be. I think people will continue to adapt and find ways to add value. I think to your point, like being like a YouTube business manager, like that wasn't a thing, but now it's probably pretty lucrative if I had to guess. And the people who are the best at that are probably doing very well for themselves. They probably have like great businesses. And so I think the world's changing, and I think people are gonna adapt, or they're not. But I just don't think that there's a very appealing situation to step into as a young professional today. I think that like the early job market is just pretty horrific, and like you hear like these like bigger corporations talking about like, hey, we don't need junior roles anymore. That stuff is like no longer a part of like our talent strategy. And so for someone who's like turning 22 or 23 and like going out into the job market, that's kind of what I experienced as like a college dropout when I first moved to New York. I was like, ooh, this is where do I begin? And like that's where I turned to like freelancing and like upskilling. And I think that a lot of people will follow that path as well. And so this is something I have a lot of empathy for, and I hope that Contra can have like a huge role in that.
As we're winding to a close, is there any last final words that you would give to the audience?
If anyone out there is going through a time where it's, they're going through their trials of life, just keep going. It's not supposed to be easy. And if you're working on something that's meaningful and it's important to you, it should be challenging, and push through the challenges, just keep going. I've had a lot of people tell me that along the way. And I think, being persistent and, just continuing on your journey, I think is one of the most important parts. So just enjoy the ride.
To the audience, remember that we're all legendary and have an amazing story of our own. So on the journey, take the time to be kind, grind, and unwind. Let's make the world a better and more creative place. Ben, thanks so much.
And I really appreciate you having me on. It's great to see you, man. It's been too long.